Right? All right, so question number 2 on the exam was about problems with mixed economies. How or why mixed economies get in trouble. So we need some ideas, right? So you had asking questions, right? About mixed economies. So what are some of the problems? Yeah.
So they are just importing, not exporting.
What is it?
They are just importing, not exporting.
Oh, mixed economies, well, maybe true, maybe not true. Some economies are able to export, so export is not a fundamental problem of a mixed economy. So well, let's write import, export is usually okay, not a major problem. Sometimes problem, sometimes not a problem.
Some companies are state-owned, and this can lead to misuse.
Some companies are state-owned. So, state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises are usually, come on, all right guys, I'm trying to explain to you good stuff, important stuff. State-owned enterprises are usually a problem. They usually turn out to be a big problem. The biggest problem with state-owned enterprises is they don't really care about profit. They don't have true market forces to force them to become inefficient. State-owned enterprises know that if there is a problem, the government will save them. If there is a problem, the government will bail them out. If there is a problem, the government will take care of them. So they don't try to be efficient, they don't try to be healthy, they don't really care. So big problem is state-owned enterprises, which turn out to be usually extremely inefficient, and they produce a lot of expensive goods or services. Whatever they produce, because of their inefficiency, they are producing very expensive goods, whatever they may be. Other problems.
On the other hand, private-owned enterprises were especially the banks, were too long able to do whatever they wanted. For example,
so again, very good. But here is now how we say it properly and correctly. They were able, banks were able to do whatever they want because, because they also got bailed out by the government. So we properly say that they are acting as if they are state-owned. We say in English quasi-government enterprises. So banks, so your classmates' idea is excellent, but we say that banks act as if they're government enterprises because they act in a way that they know that no matter what happens, the government will have to save us because we are important, because we are strategic, because we are whatever it is. So problems with mixed economies is that you have a lot of enterprises which are state-owned or government-owned, but you also have a whole bunch of them which are quasi-government. They act as if they are government-owned. They are protected. Now, what about next one? Corruption. Corruption, right? What did we say about corruption? Corruption.
I have a question to the quasi-government.
Okay, quasi-government, yes.
Because if they act like they are government-owned, how do they act like this? Or
Well, they act meaning they are irresponsible. They provide bad loans. They don't really care about the long term. They care only about the short term. They care only about the bonus which they're going to get at the end of the year. And they don't care because they know that if something goes wrong, the government will save them. That's what the German government did and saved a lot of German banks which were in trouble. Same did with the French. Of course, the American government saved all of their banks. The British government saved all of their banks. So many governments saving their banks because the banks were, they didn't really care, okay? Or they knew, they simply said, hey, it doesn't matter because the government is going to save us anyway, okay? And the government did, all right? Is it clear? Question? Next one, corruption is not a correct answer because corruption is a problem of rich, very developed nations. It is a problem of poor nations. Corruption is a problem which is not related to a mixed economy. Corruption is a problem, but it's not a problem of a mixed economy. It can happen and will happen in any type of economy. So corruption is what we call a general problem. It refers to rich, to poor. You also got a lot of corruption in socialist countries. You got a lot of corruption in communist countries. You got corruption in free market economies. So whatever the system, you get corruption as a problem. So corruption is, strictly speaking, not a problem of a mixed economy. Other. Yeah, what about you? No?
Me?
Yeah? Any other problem of a mixed economy?
You also had in the question developing countries, and so we wrote down that the step from command economy to mixed economy can be pretty difficult, and this can lead to problems.
Yes, from command economy, yes. So the transition from command economy is usually difficult. Part of the problem is that they have a lot of corruption. That's a different issue. Let's write another problem which is related to command economies and especially to mixed economies. We discussed last time bureaucracy and paperwork. Bureaucracy. Mixed economies have a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork. It's a fundamental problem for any economy which is driven by bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy goes usually hand in hand with regulations. A fundamental problem of mixed economy is too many regulations. The government is regulating everything. Okay, big problem. For everything there is a requirement, for everything there is a form, for everything there is a bureaucrat responsible, for everything you need permission. So that's where the problems are. But here is the fundamental problem of a mixed economy is big government. And big government, of course, as in France and Germany, means two things at the same time. Means big spending and the other one, which you can get to feel in Germany a lot, big taxes. Taxes usually kill an economy. taxes usually say, hey, it's not worth investing in this country anymore. If the government's going to take 50% out of my profits in Germany, I'd better invest in Bulgaria. Bulgaria is going to take only 10 instead of 50%. So, big taxes is usually a killer problem. Also, big spending. Let's write what Margaret Thatcher said in, in the late 1970s, it was actually in the early 1980s. She said, the problem with socialism is in the sense of a mixed economy, is that you run out of other people's money. You run out of other people's money. So, problem with mixed economy is that you keep spending other people's money. This big spending is big spending by the government, and the government does not spend its own money. The government spends other people's money. And spending by the government is typically, or usually, almost always inefficient. Inefficient. So, not only government-owned enterprises are inefficient, but whatever the government spends its money on is usually inefficient. So, these are some of the fundamental problems. Any other problems with mixed economies? Any other? Is it good enough? Maybe, all right? Okay, so anything else on mixed economies? I mean, you get to look at what are the problems in France, what are the problems in Germany, and you can come up with some of the answers. But the answers usually revolve that sooner or later, big government will, with big spending and taxes, will result in big deficit. Deficit is in fiscal deficit, government deficit, okay? And the big deficit in turn will result in big debt. So usually mixed economies will have a lot of debt. Of course, example will be Greece. Greece will be a mixed economy where government intervenes in everything, supports everything, spending and all the other things. And big debt will usually result sooner or later in a debt crisis. Eventually, you run out of money to spend, and then you run out of money to borrow. In other words, they see that you're a bad government, that you can't have your own, you can't pay your own stuff, and sooner or later they will stop lending you. Another example of an economy that has grown big and mixed is Japan. In Japan, again, the government's protecting everything. Too many protected industries. Protected industries. When an industry is protected, it does not have to innovate, it does not have to serve the consumer well, it doesn't have to provide a very good product. Okay, so protected industries usually become fat, bloated, inefficient, and eventually cause problems. Usually it's implemented. Example of a protected industry will be the US auto industries. The United States government protected its auto industry for way too long. I mean, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, the US auto industry was the #1 in the world, and over time, as it was getting worse and worse and worse, the government was protecting US auto industry to the point now that you come to Bulgaria, you don't see a lot of American cars. You're now here in Thailand, you can't see American cars because they're not competitive. They're not competitive usually, or sometimes, because they were protected for too long by the government. So you got a lot of businesses which are usually inefficient, and they are asking for protection by the government. And when the government gives them protection, the result is even more inefficiency. And these are some of the fundamental problems in there. All right, I think the theory, we're now switching back to, any more questions on mixed economies? Any more questions on, yes?
Are you keen on this word, or is it just if you wrote something like this?
Yeah, if you wrote something like this, I'm not keen on the exact keywords. I'm keen on the fundamental ideas, on basic understanding, right? I mean, if you're German, you should know what's wrong with the French economy, right? So just tell me what's wrong with the French economy, and that will work, okay? Of course, you could know what's wrong with the British economy, and that will also work, okay? So, all right. Other questions? You guys have any other questions related to mixed economies? All right, no? Okay. Can anyone tell me which theory, is it now theory number 6, I think, is a new trade theory. Last time we covered a number of trade theories. We covered mercantilism, right? Then we covered the absolute advantage. After that we covered the relative advantage by Ricardo, right? After the relative advantage, we cover, what is it, Heckscher-Ohlin? You guys remember? Heckscher-Ohlin theory we cover, which is the factor endowment theory. After that, we covered the product life cycle theory by Raymond Vernon. So this should be number 5. Now number 6. New trade theory. In a new trade theory, the key is economies of scale. Economies of scale occurs when, as quantity of output increases, the average cost decreases. And the reason, the economic reason, is large fixed costs. Large fixed costs. In other words, to produce the first BMW is extremely expensive, right? It could easily cost 50 million, 100 million. But the second one is relatively cheap because you already got the machines, you got the equipment, you got the design, you got the testing, you got everything going on. So copy number 2 is cheap. Number 3 is even cheaper. Number 4 is even cheaper. So with each new unit, the cost, meaning the average cost per unit, keeps falling. Another example besides the automotive will be software. In software, the big cost is developing the software, testing it, doing everything right. And once the software is up and running, which could cost 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, okay? After that, copy number 2 literally costs $1 to burn the next CD, or it's almost free because the next one can download it. So, usually you have huge economies of scale associated with software. Software, if you double the quantity of software sold, the average cost falls in half. Okay, so I have a huge economies of scale there. A third example with great economies of scale, with, again, very large fixed initial cost, will be pharmaceuticals. Medicine. Developing one single pill, one medicine that works is extraordinarily expensive. Again, it could cost 100 million, 200 million dollars easily, because you need a lot of chemists, then you need to produce it. You got the machines, the equipment, all the testing. The testing of medicine is the extremely important part. Once you got it up and running, the cost, the actual manufacturing cost, is maybe 100 times lower than the sales price. And as you keep selling more, manufacturing more, the average cost keeps falling and falling and falling and falling. So with economies of scale, you benefit tremendously by expanding output, by expanding production. And economies of scale, if you got an economies of scale, it makes sense to specialize. So economies of scale will cause specialization. And one of the main results here is a major product variety. Let's explain the product variety with an example. Product variety, a product is a car, okay? And I already gave you the example. The example was Germans will specialize in the upper niche, like the Mercedes, BMW, and Audi. And the French will be in the relatively lower niche, okay? But variety will also come where, let's say, British will specialize in cars like Rolls-Royce, the ultra luxury segment. And another ultra luxury car will be Bentley. Okay, so Bentley and Maserati. Oh, sorry, Bentley. Now, Italians will be specializing in the sports cars, the so-called exotic cars. And these will be Maserati, Lamborghini, Ferrari, okay? So, Maserati, Lamborghini, Ferrari will take, again, these are expensive cars and increasing with a huge economies of scale, making the next car gets everything cheaper and cheaper. So, you still have cars and they're all transportation, but you're gonna have the mainstream car, which will be Honda and Toyota, done by the Japanese. You're going to have the specialty cars by the British, Rolls-Royce, the ultra-luxury cars and Bentleys. You're going to have the sports cars, the exotic cars, okay? So these are all examples where you're going to have economies of scale leading to product variety. Same thing with software. One will produce one type of software and sell as many as you can. Another one will produce a different type of software. A third one will produce a third type of software. You're going to get a lot more. Same thing with product variety comes with pharmaceuticals. You're going to produce one type of pill. Somebody's going to produce a second type of pill. A third one's going to produce a third type of pill. So you're going to have this. Economies of scale will result in high fixed cost and reduced, as in falling average costs. Falling average costs. Okay? So falling average cost means that if you can create higher volume, you're going to be more competitive. The reduced average cost means you're going to get more competitive with more volume. But here is another key, and that's where it gets very, very tricky. If you are first, and you're the first one to produce the product, and you're able to expand the product without competition, and your costs keep falling and falling and falling, you get what's called a first mover advantage. first mover advantage is usually advantage associated with the first business which enters a particular country or the first business which enters a particular market. If you're the first business entering that particular market, you get a first mover advantage because your cost is falling and falling and falling and already low, and the new competitor will have a very high cost. It is going to be very difficult to enter. So you get a lot of first mover advantage, and the competition has very, very hard times to enter the market. Yes, question?
Isn't it better to be the first follower?
Sometimes, okay, let's write this out. Let's write it in red. This is not related to new trade theory. It's called second mover advantage. All right, I'm explaining now your question because it's a good one. Second mover. Second mover advantage is the advantages which accrue to you or from which you benefit when you happen to be the second one, not the first one. Well, what kind of advantages you get when you're a second one? Well, the number one advantage is you already learn by watching what the first guys did. You already learn by observing the mistakes that they did so that you can avoid those mistakes. And another major advantage is that when you're at the second guy, you don't have to educate the consumer about the product. The consumer is familiar with the product. They understand what the product is and how it works and what it does. So you don't need any special training and education of the consumer. When you're the first mover, you will have to educate the consumer about, hey, this is what the product is and this is what the product does and so on. So the answer is yes, in many businesses, it actually pays and you get to benefit when you're the second mover. But not in those industries with economies of scale. With those industries with economies of scale, the second mover has what's called the second mover disadvantage. Because you're the second one, you cannot build and profit from the economies of scale, but the first mover can build and can profit. They already have many, many units to sell. They already have the brand name, they have the knowledge, and the key one is they already have the reduced and steadily falling cost. Okay, example is, think of let's say an electric company, you're an electricity company, you generate electricity, you already have the network, you already have the brand name, you already have the scale, you already have the capacity. If you're trying to open a second electric network, it's going to be extremely expensive. And you got to get a customer by customer by customer, which is very, very, very difficult. And in this case, you got what's called now a completely different concept in business called a switching cost. Switching cost is when the customer, it costs them money or benefit to switch from one product to another product, from the same product from one company to another company. Okay? So, first mover advantage is a major, major, major advantage here. And here is where the new trade theory gets very important. If you get an extraordinary advantage from being the first one, this says that, well, the government can actually intervene, and it can intervene for the benefit of the economy. So, this, we say, justifies government intervention. The government can intervene so that it can help benefit from the economies of scale. A different way of saying is that it can get the business started, get a new industry. What this basically means is that this justifies so-called government subsidies. Hey, this is a new industry. It is a very important industry. The government believes that the industry has a bright future. It's going to benefit a lot of people. It's going to benefit the economy. It's going to create a lot of jobs. And here is a very good example where in those circumstances it truly pays for the government to provide subsidies and to get the economy, get the industry going in this particular case. The example where the government is doing this is Korea. Korean government is helping Samsung and Hyundai to develop these new products, to develop these new technologies so that they can truly benefit from this. And the Korean government appears to be intervening in the market truly for the benefit of the economy, not hurting the economy. Question?
But isn't it also that some governments subsidize some companies if nobody else would enter this particular market, and they have to provide it, like sometimes the transportation sector?
Again, the question is why private business will not enter the market. It will not enter the market because it can't make enough profits. You see, when you say, well, the private business cannot does not want to enter the market, you always must explain what is the exact reason. For example, solar energy and solar panels are very expensive today. And if they are very expensive today, let's say 3 times more expensive than coal energy, no one will invest in solar energy unless the government provides the subsidy. If the government provides the subsidy, they say, okay, with the subsidy, I will make this particular investment. And here is the key. Solar panel energy is claimed to have significant economies of scale. So if you're producing only 100 megawatts, then you're not going to lower the cost a lot. But if you produce tens or hundreds of gigawatts of energy, in other words, if you're manufacturing millions or tens of millions of solar panels, in that particular case, you can bring down the cost of manufacturing sufficiently 3 or 4 times so that solar energy will compete with other alternative energies. And if it can compete with other alternative energies, you can become the leading economy in the world manufacturing solar panels. Okay? That's at least what the Japanese government did with monitors like this one. It's called the LCD monitors. Monitors, you can move the camera. These were originally developed in the US, but the Japanese government was the one that subsidized and provided the incentives and whatnot, to the point where they had huge fixed costs which were involved in the development and later on beginning the manufacturing. And as they got to manufacture more and more and more and more in the tens of millions, costs dropped dramatically to the point where these got extremely cheap. They were cheap. But the key is which government helped their industry to get to develop this industry or this product first, okay? So that's another example where the government really helps with those things. Okay, let's see what else we got. We got the first mover advantage, I did that. Okay, new trade theory. The last piece, which is, again, I explained as part of the lower and lower and lower cost, is that these economies of scale not only provide the first mover advantage, but it provides a second mover disadvantage, which we call barrier to entry. The example which I just provided with the solar panels. If solar panels cost 3 times more and the German government decides that it will subsidize them for 5 years, for the next 5 years you can build industry that is, let's say, tens of millions of units to bring down the cost sufficiently for the solar panels industry in Germany to become competitive. But it will still be a problem, and other countries and other industries will still have a problem to enter the industry. Because if Sweden wants to start, it's still going to be too expensive. If France wants to start, it's still going to be too expensive. If Australia starts, it's still going to be too expensive. So any country wants to start this business, the very high cost with which you start is effectively acting as a barrier to entry, and it keeps only the first one or the first few movers at an advantage and all the late entrants at a disadvantage. We call these early movers and late movers. So these type of economies of scale create early mover advantages and late mover disadvantages. Okay. And now we get to a topic which your classmate asked me a while ago, and I said, okay. You had a question? You had a question or anything clear?
It's already said.
Okay, already covered. And we finish today with number 7. Number 7 is called national competitive advantage. And a national competitive advantage is basically advantage which a nation has over its competitors. Of course, the first example, we've mentioned it many times, will be the German auto industry. The whole industry, the whole country has a significant advantage over other countries in producing and manufacturing cars. Well, similar competitive advantage will have Japan. Japan's going to have a similar advantage, and now Korea is also developing a similar advantage, where Korean cars are getting good, they're getting high quality, they're getting very cheap, and they're getting overall competitive. As I was explaining to some of you before, is Bulgarian taxi drivers, when they drive a taxi, say, hey, oh, you're riding a Hyundai, Korean Hyundai. Say, is it good? Say, oh, Hyundai #1 for taxi. Is the best car for taxi. I say, really? He says, yeah, it's solid, it's reliable, its suspension is very good for Bulgarian roads, and it's cheap. It's a lot cheaper than the other cars, okay? So, cheap means competitive. For the taxi, it means relatively good quality at a relatively low price. So, the quality to price ratio provided by Korean cars is excellent. You probably know about example of a country, nation with competitive. Come on, guys and girls, all right? We're trying to finish. I got about 5 more minutes so to explain things. Will be France doing wines. The French have a competitive advantage with wines. They got, all right. You guys finish? France having advantage with wines. They are very good at winemaking. They have a history of winemaking. They have a knowledge of winemaking. So, when you have an industry, you need to have the experts. You need to have the expertise. You need to have the history. You need to have the knowledge. So, which are those components that you need to have to gain a competitive advantage? And number 1 is factor endowments. In order to build the cars, the first major endowment is Engineers, many engineers, a lot of engineers. If you're going to be building pharmaceutical industry, you should have, yeah, all right, guys, okay, finish. We're done. Everyone's talking. All right, finish. Time. I mean, they just talk.